Hi, this is Zibby Owens, and you're listening to the award-winning podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I'm also the host of Moms Don't Have Time to Lose Weight, and I'm the editor of the anthology, which you should run out and buy, called Moms Don't Have Time to, a Quarantine Anthology. All proceeds of that book go to COVID-19 vaccine research. And I'm the editor-in-chief of Moms Don't Have Time to Write, a new publication on Medium, and we're accepting submissions, so please send your personal essays there. And if all that isn't enough, you can follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens, and my website is zibbyowens.com. Okay, now back to this amazing podcast. I was so honored to interview Joyce Carol Oates. I really couldn't even believe it when an email came across my, inbox where she was CC'd, and I had to confirm our interview for the Streicker Center at Temple Emanu-El. I was going to write back, Joyce, so excited. But then I was like, how can I just call her Joyce? I feel like, I don't know. So anyway, I interviewed her for the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. It was amazing, and hundreds of people were there listening virtually. This is the recording of that interview, which I did that day, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. For those of you who don't know, Joyce Carol Oates is America's most prolific and celebrated living author. She published her first book at the age of 26, won the National Book Award when she was just 31, and for her 58 novels and scores of plays, novellas, short stories, poetry, and essays, won the National Humanities Medal, the Jerusalem Prize, 2 O. Henry Awards, and has been a 5-time finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. We talked about her collection of poems, American Melancholy, and a collection of stories, The Other You. Enjoy our conversation. Hi, how are you? I feel like I can't just call you Joyce. I feel like, I don't know, that seems way too informal. So
Joyce is fine.
Okay, I'm delighted to meet you. Thank you for doing this program with the Streicker Center. I am a huge fan of yours, and your latest works were truly unbelievable, American Melancholy and The Other You. I was hoping that as an introduction, you could talk a little bit about why you decided to write these two, especially as they released the same month, and why these two now? And I know that maybe we could start with the poems, which I know came from a lot of different places, and you decided to aggregate them. And let's talk about that, if that's okay.
Well, yes. For me, my primary means of creative expression, I suppose one could say, is prose fiction. So I don't write poetry every day. Usually my periods of writing poetry are sort of very intense interludes of emotional crisis or stress where everything is distilled and very concentrated. The kind of energy that you need, perhaps for most people, to write a novel is sort of like a long distance runner. And sometimes you have energy for short sprints and things that are much more concentrated. So I don't really write poetry continuously. The poems in that collection were written in very intense interludes. American Melancholy is drawn together by the fact that my husband, Charlie Groves, passed away in April 2019. So the book that I've collected these poems have very much to do with the concentration of emotion of grief and loss, and looking back at our culture in the 20th century and focusing on subjects like, I have a little section of poems on what we could call scientific malpractice or scientific misconduct and some quintessential famous research experiments. But the book is actually bookended with poems that are about the loss of my husband. So a book of poems, I think for many poets, is an occasion for some intensity and distillation. I can't really imagine that I would have another book of poems. It's my first book in 25 years.
Wow. Well, the way you wrote about your husband's, and I'm so sorry for your loss, was absolutely beautiful, per usual. But even the way you wrote about the hospice experience in the poem at the end, do you mind if I read a line or two from it? Is that okay?
That's fine.
When you said, first you have it from your point of view, and you alternate 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., with his point of view. And you said, here, I'll start here. And so on the brink of too late, when no one else is in the room, for a hospice room can be crowded, by crowded meaning more than 2 people, you tell your husband that you love him so much. What a wonderful husband he has been. And he says, but I failed you by dying. And you protest, but why are you saying such a thing? You are not dying. We are talking here together. And he says, because I am dead. As after the final biopsy, he'd been incensed. They took my soul from me. They took me to the crematorium. I saw the sign. Don't try to tell me I didn't see the sign. And then you say, trapped in this bed like a prison. Is the car out, friend? Drive the car around. Where are the keys to the car? Joyce, don't leave. Joyce, we need to get the car. Where are the keys? I want to go home. Take me home, Joyce. Don't leave me. What did we do with the car? And then at the end, you say, after such struggle, you must love the unrippled dark water in which the perfect cold O of the moon floats. Oh, it's beautiful and heartbreaking. And I'm so sorry.
Thank you. When you were reading that, I almost didn't remember that I had written some of that. I probably am afraid to look at it. I shouldn't say that. I mean, I've looked at it many times, but maybe not for months. Some things that, though we write them ourselves, we can't really bring ourselves to read them. I mean, that's been true of a lot of my writing, where the emotions are sort of pushed away by time. And then if you see them again, it becomes very fresh. So I almost couldn't believe I had written that. Of course, it's pretty much real life.
Do you feel like it helps you when you're in the moment? Does it help you sort out your feelings when you write scenes like this and put them in poetic form?
Well, I'm really haunted by certain subjects. And so I would say I'm literally haunted in the sense that my thoughts just careen around like in a whirlpool. And I try to, through meditation or other attention, to draw away from these areas of like gravity, like this intense whirlpool. And sometimes I can do that, and sometimes I can't. So I sort of concentrate on expressing what seems to want to be expressed. So I think that's true for many writers. I mean, looking back at 20th century, famous writers like Eugene O'Neill, he was obviously obsessed with his parents. He wrote so much about his father. Hemingway wrote about obliquely women who were maybe like his mother. We all have areas of being haunted. So writers are those people who focus on it, maybe trying to exorcise it, or maybe just trying to explore it.
Wow. Well, I found it interesting that you not only delved deep into your own loss, and just to clarify from the chat, I was reading from American Melancholy, the book of poems. And not only did you do this, but you literally inserted yourself as the subject in many psychology experiments. And having been a psychology major way back in the day, to read these from the point of view of the subjects and to even get more information on, some of the researchers themselves and your thoughts onto why they were even doing this, like the relation of the Holocaust. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about Maslow and the Holocaust tie-in to what you were talking about in the poem.
Well,
I'm sorry, not Maslow, Milgram, not Maslow. Maybe that didn't sound right.
Well, Maslow was another person that I could write about maybe some other time. I'm interested in him also. But Stanley Milgram was Jewish, and he was a young assistant professor, I think, at Yale. He was probably like many Jews. He was haunted by the phenomenon of the Holocaust, and probably, I would surmise, many of his European relatives probably perished in the death camps. So Stanley Milgram, as a young psychologist, wanted to try to understand that phenomenon, how we know that Hitler was insane, he was a homicidal maniac, and maybe the high-ranking Nazis were. But the Nazi phenomenon could not have taken place without the cooperation of average people, average German citizens. That it's almost like an industrial apparatus of the so-called final solution that required many people, thousands or hundreds of thousands of cooperative Germans. So Stanley Milgram, as a young research psychologist, wanted to understand how anybody could follow orders the way these people did. And so the famous or infamous series of experiments called Studies in Obedience that made Stanley Milgram very famous and very notorious. And he didn't get tenure at Yale. I think the backlash against him for exposing something about human nature that people didn't want to accept, he really suffered in the backlash, and he actually wasn't kept on at Yale. He may have gone somewhere else, equally prestigious. I'm not remembering if he went to Columbia or someplace. So people correct me if I'm wrong. But Stanley Milgram, I thought was just astonishing as a psychologist, very interesting. At the same time, we feel in looking at his experiments that he too was experimenting with people. He wasn't telling them quite the truth at all. He wasn't telling his subjects that they were being experimented on. So maybe in a way, he was trespassing. That's probably the bottom line of that poem that I wrote is questioning Milgram himself.
Well, and I think that's one of the themes that you touch on in so many of these poems is who has the right to exert sort of their own theories on other people and their own will on other people, whether it's a man not treating a woman right in a relationship or a science experiment or any of these ways. I feel like you're meditating on the meaning of power and what makes someone sort of a victim as well. I feel like it was just kind of coursing. And then, of course, as you said, bookended with your own loss to make, a very powerful package of reflections designed to really make the reader think through all of that.
Well, you said you were a psychology major, so you obviously studied the famous experiment Little Albert.
Yes.
The conditioning, how easy it is to condition. You can condition anyone of any age, but particularly an infant who had no volition and had no protection. His mother really sort of gave him over to this experiment. Of course, his mother, I think, was a cleaning woman, and she was paid like $1. It was very sad. But little Albert, he was a victim of an experiment we would consider incredibly cruel today.
And of course, you point out nobody deconditioned all the subjects in all of these studies. No one took the time to get them sort of back to normal. Instead, they just sort of let them into the world to fend for themselves.
It is amazing. Well, John Watson is considered the father of advertising. Mm-hmm. The advertising was a commercial replication and application of the ideas of Pavlovian conditioning on human beings, where you condition them to purchase your Cadillac or your deodorant or your shampoo, and you're doing that with images that are usually visual. And it's usually like in a magazine or later on television, whereas the original experiments, of course, were in the lab, and they were actually with people, with living people.
Wow. The other poem I loved in this collection, by the way, was when the couple was, you called it Too Young to Marry, but Not Too Young to Die, about the couple that you said together beneath the ice in each other's arms, Jean Marie's head rested on Troy's shoulder. Their hair had floated up and was frozen. Their eyes were open in the perfect lucidity of death. Calmly, they sat upright, not a breath. Just so beautiful. And then you said, yet you could believe they might be breathing, for some trick of scintillate light revealed tiny bubbles in the ice, an emotion like a smile in Jean Marie's perfect fate. So it was about a couple that fell into the ice, and this couple is young, and you said, they weren't even old enough to get married, and yet they were hugging each other, and like they seemed so happy and eyes wide open as they face death together. I don't know, it was the image. It reminded me of like the scene in the Titanic movie when the couple is sort of spooning in bed and the water is coming and they're just at peace, clutching each other. And I just feel like, I don't know, it was just a perfect poem of love in all its form.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. That appeared originally in the New Yorker, and it had the sort of narrative look to it, that it's like a story that unfolds. We are told by somebody reminiscing about when he was in high school. Everybody was in awe of these very beautiful, handsome, this couple. They were very beautiful. They were like the most popular couple and very envied. But then they had a kind of suicide pact because they weren't allowed to get married so young. So the boy drives them out into the ice, which becomes thinner as you move away from shore. And then the car broke through the ice, and they sink down and they drown together in this sort of perfect union. And then the ice closes over above them, so they could be actually seen through the transparent ice. And it's like the way we freeze memories, like romance and nostalgia are frozen back in time. Probably there are no emotions quite as strong as our adolescent emotions. They're sort of frozen back there connecting with our high school, like the corridors and the stairways and the lockers and the classrooms of a high school for people who'd gone there are just fraught with emotion, all kinds of adrenaline. Somebody else looking at it sees nothing. But the people who were once there and once teenagers, they feel so strongly.
Well, I'm glad you said that because my kids who are in kindergarten and first grade go to my same school where I went to high school. And I often find myself like lost in my own memories walking through and have to be jolted back to the fact that somehow I have kids next to me who are who are like, how do I have kids? I feel like I'm 14 whenever I walk through the hallway. So yes, there's something about.
Yeah, that's a wonderful image. I mean, I could see writing a poem about that. You're with your own children in this building and they are forming their memories and their emotions. And you're right beside them. It's like the two generations and different decades. And it's so rich. It's such a rich subject for a poem.
I'm not such a poet, but maybe I'll try writing an essay about it now that you've inspired me to do that. You can write a poem about it.
You could write a poem from the point of view of the person thinking it, who's not necessarily you. I mean, anybody can write poetry, I think, from a narrative voice perspective. Like, it's not you. It's not lyric poetry, but it's like a narrative monologue. You could certainly do that.
Well, that's the question really about poetry that I wonder, and I was wondering while I was reading your collection, is what necessarily makes it a poem? Could I take a paragraph that I wrote in an essay, and if I change the form, would it become a poem? Like, how do you know it's a poem? I know that sounds ridiculous, but some lyrical language, if you morphed the form of it, I feel like could be more poetic. But how do you know when you have a poem versus a paragraph?
Well, it's a good question. Poetry is essentially very experimental, working with language. I think that you can take any passage that you care about. You have to have some emotional investment. That is the secret of poetry. When we read poetry like Shakespeare or Mary Oliver or Sharon Olds or Henri Cole, we're sort of reading this encapsulated intense emotion that's been really polished and maybe like a stone that's been made smooth and aesthetically beautiful. It's not raw emotion. It's not like somebody screaming, but it's been sort of shaped. So anything that you personally care about, you could work into a poem if you took time. It's a meditative act. Much of my writing time is spent walking or running and thinking. In other words, maybe 80% of writing is thinking beforehand of the tone that you want and just trying to choose the sort of vocabulary. The actual writing time is secondary.
So tell me about your running. How much running do you do?
Well, I try to run every day. When it's cold, I don't go out as much. And I run and walk, sort of walk very fast. If I'm with other people, I walk. I have some women friends with whom I go walking. In the pandemic, we meet 2 or 3 times a week, and we just sort of walk, no matter how cold it is. We sort of bundle up just to get exercise. And when I run alone, it's more beneficial for my writing. When I'm with other people, we tend to be talking, which of course is distracting. And when warm weather, I can run quite a bit. And I would go out every day, usually in the late afternoon. And I sort of think about my writing. I live outside Princeton, about 4 miles. It's a semi-rural area. There are country roads. So I can be running past pastures of sheep and cattle. There are farms here.
Wow. Do you listen to music or you just let your thoughts gestate?
Oh, I wouldn't listen to music. I would do you have to think and concentrate on your writing.
Wow. And you don't have any pain? I'm like astounded by this running habit because it hurts my knees and I'm like, in my 40s. But anyway.
No, I don't have any pain. But I've found that if I have pain like in the knee a little bit, if I just don't run on it for a couple of days, it goes away. But I think that we have to be careful if you have a little bit of pain in your knee, many people just want to keep on running and saying, well, it's like, I won't let this stop me, or it's nothing. But I think that's a mistake. I think the best thing is to stop running for a couple of days.
Wow. And then your other recent book, The Other You, the opening story in this collection was so interesting. It was literally like what I think about all the time is, what could my life have been like? What if I hadn't have had kids? You know, what if, and of course you pin it on a moment where a woman ends up not taking this exam that she should take and that she would have aced because she was super smart. And there becomes like Youville versus the other alternative of life, which everybody must think about from time to time. What if this had happened at this moment? Would I not have had my kids? What would have happened to them? What if what if?
It's amazing. And I think the pandemic, being in quarantine and isolation for a year, has made many of us really think about alternative lives. Yeah, well, it's not only that, but you know, I don't know how you met your husband, but say you met your husband at a university or you got introduced by somebody, it would be very easy not to have met. You know, like, what would your life be? Obviously, we'd still be alive, but we would have lives that were radically different from the lives that we have.
I'm divorced and remarried. And sometimes I keep marveling at the fact that my life has become the other life that I wondered if I could have. And I literally like sometimes drive down the same street with my second husband and the two kids I had later in life and living in a different house. And I think, I can't believe that I was like, it was just me, 10 years ago, driving down the street in a different car and living in a different house. Yeah, it's really crazy.
Where do you live?
Well, I live in New York City, but I was talking about, in Long Island out in the Hamptons where I grew up. I've been going since 1979. So, so I've been traveling the same streets this whole time. And
I have a similar situation because the house I live in now with my second husband is only about 3 minutes away from the house that I lived in with my first husband who died, Ray Smith. He died in 2008. I go by that house all the time. I go out of my way to go by that house, and I remember my life there. And I have a kind of dream-like nostalgia how I could actually walk in that door and that the house would be there and all the rooms come back. And then my first husband would be in his office where he was an editor. And like everything is like a hallucination. But then it's actually 2021, and not only have I lost that first house, but I lost my second husband. And so I'm in this house alone. And life seems to be so like a dream, I think, partly because of the isolation of the past year. And yet, we're still here. We're still living our lives.
Wow. It's crazy that on top of all of this and the loss and everything, that then everyone has to be thrown into this period of time where you have to rethink everything because you're alone with your thoughts for so much of it as well. It's like a cruel joke in a way, but anyway.
But for you, you've probably been in quarantine with a family. So probably you have a lot of attention paid to the children. I mean, probably you haven't been alone as much as somebody else. So you probably have had a radically different kind of experience.
Yes, there have been moments where I would have loved to be alone. Yes, I've been, my kids have mostly been in remote school for this whole time. And I have 4 kids. And yeah, it's a lot. I have not had a lot of time alone. So, but everyone's plate has been sort of rearranged. We've all had to learn how to sort of eat again, if you will, during this time.
Yeah, so. I would guess that you as a mother have found time, maybe late at night or early in the morning when people are sleeping, that you found some special sacred quiet time for yourself.
Well, honestly, that's part of why I love doing these interviews and why I love doing my podcast and meeting people like you and having conversations, because while this isn't alone time per se, it's when I talk to people, that's how I get in touch with like who I am when I'm not, picking up toys or doing the laundry or all these like day-to-day things. Like this is such a gift. It's like connects me not just to the person I'm talking to, but to myself. I don't know if you feel that way when you talk to others.
Yes. Well, I remember my friend Toni Morrison, when she was my colleague at Princeton, she had a busy life and she was teaching and so forth. So she would get up at 5 a.m. and do her writing. She would sort of get up early and do her writing. That's, working on novels like Beloved. In other words, she found a time. Probably she would rather have been asleep, like most of us, but Toni found a time that was the sacred time. And I try to do that too. I find that because I don't have a domestic schedule, I can waste a lot of time. When my husband was living and we had more of a schedule, we would do things together. And of course, we were out in the world at that time. My life was a matter of a daily schedule. And so I would get a lot of writing done. But now with an open sort of timelessness, you think, well, I have all day long to work on my novel, so maybe I'll do this chore first or answer some emails. In other words, if you're more busy and connected with other people in the world, I think you actually get more done.
Yeah, it's like give a busy person something to do and it'll get done in 2 seconds. But
Yeah.
Are you working on a novel now?
Oh, yes, I have been working on a novel very intensely since the pandemic began. I think that it's been a great solace. And putting together the poems for American Melancholy and using the photograph on the cover of the book is a photograph taken by Charlie, my husband, of Lake George, which was his favorite place in all the world. And there are two little ducks. You can just sort of see a duck couple.
Hold it up.
Like that's supposed to. It's so melancholy. This little couple of ducks on this choppy lake is sort of like symbolic of the marriage, I suppose. And it seemed like just a perfect cover for that particular book. And the predominant tone is melancholy, but there are some poems that are meant to be funny, like the one about the cat, the different kind of cat, catteral, doggerel, And there are a few, and the one about Marlon Brando is supposed to have some humor in it. So it isn't all melancholy. And then also with The Other You, the story called The Unexpected, where the woman writer, she's not young any longer, she goes back to her hometown, which is the hometown of the first story, Uville. And then she meets these people like went to high school and grade school with her. And they're all so jealous and mean. And they keep asking her these awful questions. Are you sorry that you didn't have any children? Or are you alone? Or could you do your career over again? Or the questions that they put to her are really kind of niggardly and nasty. All that is meant to be somewhat funny, in a dark, humorous way.
Even the one about the friend waiting for her friend to show up late at the restaurant at the vegan place. And you're like, they didn't even really love vegetarian food, but like they thought they should be there. And even how you kind of joke that the one of them had another child because the other had another child, and they were funny.
Well, I think that women friends who have known each other a long time are really like sisters, and they're very supportive emotionally. And there's a kind of a quiet intensity. The friendship goes on for so many years. They know each other so well. Some of the bonds are even stronger than between a husband and a wife, because the wife doesn't always want to tell the husband, some things where you're more likely to tell a woman friend. My friends and I, we call ourselves like the girlfriends. It's hard to believe that we're well beyond being girls, because there's a kind of girlish connection of often humor and, teasing and playfulness that you'll find among women friends. But the women friends, that story is one of my favorites. And there are 3 stories in the collection, all set at the same vegetarian restaurant. It's a place that I knew in Berkeley that Charlie and I would go to. One of these menus with all this, lots of kale, lots of organic and things that don't sound, they don't really sound very appetizing, but they're politically correct.
Although you end up having like a bomber show up at this restaurant, so in the past, and there's a lot of history to the restaurant in the story, so it's not exactly like a sweet treat.
In each story, he shows up some way in each story. One story, he seems to be there. Another story, he has been there. And another story, you sort of hear what he's thinking. As he himself is so dissociated. Like he wants to set off a bomb, and he wants to cause a catastrophe, but he doesn't really comprehend that he's going to die. Like he sort of thinks to himself, well, this isn't really going to happen, is it? Like I didn't do very well in chemistry and science in high school. I'm really not going to be successful. And I think probably a lot of people who do desperate things, maybe including suicide, a part of their brain is thinking, well, this is not really going to happen. I'm just going to sort of play through the gesture, which is somewhat theatrical. And suicide bombing is so theatrical. It probably rarely achieves any kind of goal at all, except to destroy human life. That there must be some element of dissociation, that the person doesn't really think he's dying. Or with some religious-oriented or politically religious-oriented suicide bombings, that they actually think they're going to go to heaven. So they're going to be in some other dimension. They don't really think they're just going to be annihilated. So with any kind of suicide gesture, there must be some element of hallucination and fantasy.
When you start a new project as sort of a living literary legend who's won all these awards, and you must feel a sense of accomplishment and confidence in your writing. When you start something new, do you ever feel worried, like that it's not going to be good, or like your luck has run out? Or do you approach everything like knowing what you want to say? Or like, what is it like when you start a new project, like the novel you're working on now?
Well, let's say that writing is a kind of activity. It's cerebral and also emotional. So you know that you're going to do some writing if you're a writer, like next Monday, you're going to be writing. So you have this sort of a ferocity of yearning to be creative. So what are you going to do with that? It's like harnessing some power. Are you going to work on a poem? Are you going to work on a short story? Or are you going to work on a novel? You're sort of choosing what to do with this yearning to write or to compose something. But if you're haunted by a subject, you're probably going to be limited to writing about that particular subject. If you look at the very last paintings in Van Gogh's life, which are very thick, the brush strokes are very thick, and they're all natural scenes, like of the sky and the landscape, in the sun or flowers. It's everything very thick. You can feel that the artist Van Gogh was totally in the throes of a kind of dream-like intensity of emotion that maybe he couldn't really control. So it's a kind of benign compulsion. I say it's benign because it's productive. It's not that somebody is just washing her hands, over and over again in a non-productive way. So if you are a writer, and I'm friendly with Margaret Atwood, we're almost the same age, and we sort of came of age in Canada. When I lived in Canada, Margaret was a very rapidly rising poet, and I was writing prose fiction books. But I think Margaret Atwood probably shares with me this feeling that you never really have mastered anything. You do know from the past that if you work at it, sort of diligently every morning, as long as you can, you will achieve something, but you don't know how hard it will be. You don't know how long it will take. You don't know how miserable you might be. So it's both, to answer your question, it's both something that is familiar because you've done it before, but unpredictable because you don't really know what it's going to be. A writer who's written novels is challenged not to repeat herself. So each novel should be stylistically different. I try to make my novels different from one another. If I have a long novel like Night, Sleep, Death, the Stars is my most recent long novel. I could show you this. It's over here. So this is a really long novel. You can see that this is a family novel with the parents and about 5 children. So my next novel, which is coming out in August, is much shorter. It's about a marriage after the husband has died. It's very much a sort of memoirist novel, which is really only about 2 people with, some people in the background. Whereas this long novel is about about 7 people, and I'm moving from one person to the other, and has a lot to do with politics in America right now. The new novel is very intense and limited to 2 people, almost nothing, really almost nothing at all about politics in America. Mostly the emotional intensity of losing a spouse, being unable to save the spouse in any way, and then being haunted. Most of the novel is about the aftermath of a loss and how we're haunted by grief, but in the novel, literally haunted by thinking she sees the husband. And maybe she really sees the husband. We don't really know. So that's an example of how, because you've written one thing, the next thing you do might be much shorter, or the next thing you do might be a book of nonfiction. It's sort of reacting against what you've done most recently.
Sounds like it could be a play. Can't you see it? Maybe.
No, it couldn't. It really couldn't be a play because it has a lot of hallucinatory passages that are very dreamlike, and they're in this unfamiliar setting. I think that losing somebody takes you to a new world, and literally they're in New Mexico. They're in a place sort of like Santa Fe, but it's not Santa Fe, but it's like Santa Fe, and the landscape is that beautiful. The beautiful landscape of New Mexico, which is really inhuman. It's an austere, russet red, mountainous landscape without much green in it. And it's sort of like Georgia O'Keeffe country, very austere and sort of lunar. It's like you're on the moon or on the Mars or someplace. So that's where this novel sort of plays out. Whereas the novel that I've been showing you is actually much of it's set right in the room I'm in right now, because it's very much an autobiographical novel. And the widow in this novel is living in a house like my house. So I've done some Zoom interviews about this novel, which is so weird because the woman in the novel is in this room a lot, and I'm literally in the same room.
What is the title? Someone's asking in the chat. What's the title of the novel going to be? Does it have one yet?
Yes, it's called Breathe.
Oh, I think it's going to be great.
Yeah. Well, we all have the hospital vigil. I don't feel I'm the only one who's ever gone through it, but I have actually written about the hospital vigil in The Other You, the hospice. We all go through it. Well, you're at the hospital all day long and leave at night and come back in the morning, and you get to know the elevator you take, and you walk down the corridor, you go in a certain room. It's so, I don't know, I guess a universal experience, and each person suffers it or endures it alone. We are all alone. At the same time, it's universal.
Do you have any advice for someone just starting out who wants to be a writer or trying to be a writer?
Well, I teach a writing workshop every semester. I teach in the fall, I teach at NYU, and I teach at Princeton. And right now I'm teaching a course at Rutgers. Of course, they're all Zoom. In my course at Rutgers, I have about 15, just by accident, all women. In fact, Margaret Atwood is going to visit our class today. And writers are people who've been reading. I think that we become writers because we read when we're young, when we're very young, and maybe our parents read to us, children's books with pictures, and the parent reads this little text, and after a while, the child has heard the story many times, and the child starts to read. I think that's how parents teach their children to read, in literate cultures. Did you do that sort of thing, like reading to your children?
I still do that type of thing, just like my mom did to me. And yes, I love it. And sometimes they're like, they love it. But usually I'm so tired at that point of the night. I'm like, why do I always save this for the night when I'm my most tired? Why don't we read at like 3 p.m. when I'm full of energy? And they're like,
don't they like that?
They love it.
Particularly, like they're all cuddling in bed, and then they fall asleep, and their mother's reading to them. I think that's really lovely.
Yes, no, it's nice. And I try to remind myself when they ask for a second book, I'm like, it's not like they're asking for iPad time. Like, I should give them a second book. It's a second book.
I wish I had my children's book here to show you, because I I've written a number of children's books, but they're in another room, so I can't. They're all about kittens.
Aw,
Each book is about a kitten.
love it. Well, I will stock up on your children's books now that.
So thank you very much. There's a lot of great thank yous in our chat. And thank you, Joyce. And thank you, Zibby.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram at Zibby Owens and at Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. Also sign up for my newsletter at zibbyowens.com and sign up for my virtual book club and meet lots of authors on Zoom every other week. Thanks so much to Steve and Ryan at Texture Sound for the sound editing. And thank you to Morning Moon Productions for providing this fantastic intro and outro music.